we're happy to welcome Anastasia Volovich to discuss recent developments in N=4 super Yang-Mills amplitudes. Here you go.
All right. It's great to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak and for organizing this great conference. So I'm going to tell you about some recent developments in N=4 Yang-Mills theory amplitudes. My talk is going to be based on these 4 papers. So these are together with Mark Spradlin, our current postdoc and former NEMA student, Akshay Yelishpur Srikant, my former student who is now a postdoc at Oxford, Anders Schreiber, and 2 of my current students, Jorge Margo and Li Cheng Ren. They should be somewhere on Zoom. Next slide. Okay, so planar N=4 Yang-Mills scattering amplitudes have been computed to very high order, as you'll see momentarily. Now, they have remarkable properties that sparked interest from various mathematicians who work on combinatorics, on algebraic geometry, and number theory. On the other hand, several methods that have been developed in the past decade for these N=4 amplitudes are directly applicable and have been greatly helped the QCD computations. So it's an interesting area to think about. So in my talk, what I'm going to do is I'll just give you a short update, tell you a little bit about some of the recent developments here. And in particular, in the second part of my talk, I'll describe some of the approaches that hope to explain some of the properties of these amplitudes using various mathematical constructions. So a more precise outline of the talk is right here. So first I will review basically one slide status and then review some tools, sort of main tools that we use to compute these amplitudes. Then I'm going to review the 6 and 7 points and their connection to cluster algebras. Then I'm going to outline some new and interesting features that start appearing beyond 7 points. So I'll explain what these features are, and these are the sort of the area of the sort of the forefront of these computations, and I will explain how some of these things could be obtained from Plaby graphs and tensor diagrams. So the second part is going to be a little bit more technical based on these papers I just mentioned. Okay, very good. Status. Okay, so what's the status of these computations? Well, yeah, you've heard a lot of talks about 4-point amplitudes. Here, 4 and 5 points are kind of trivial. They are known to all loop orders because of dual conformal symmetry, because we're studying a very special theory such as N=4. These amplitudes are given by something called BDS ansatz to all loop orders. So the interesting things start happening at 6 points. And due to the heroic efforts of these people, and please, I refer you to this review for sort of the progress and the update on this, the 7 points have been computed through 7 loops, and 6 points have been computed through 7 loops, and 7 points have been computed through 4 loops. Now, more recently, Song He and his group computed 8 and 9 point NMHV amplitudes through 2 loops. So that's maybe the results of the last year and a half. And of course, if we want to go beyond 9, so for n greater than 9, MHV amplitudes have been known through 2 loops since 2010, and they were computed by Simon 10 years ago. Okay, very good. So how are these computed? How are these high loop computations done? Well, they're not computing by evaluating this 7 loop Feynman diagram. And instead they're computed by what's known an amplitude bootstrap. So how do we do that? Well, we, as usual, write down the answer as a linear combination of functions and determine the coefficients by solving a system of linear constraints. So what I've done here, so it's easy to say, but very, very difficult to do. So here I've copied a table from this review by Lance Dixon and collaborators that I've already referred to. And here you can see the number. So this table lists the number of remaining parameters in the ansatz for, say, 6. So this table is for 6-point amplitude after each constraint is applied at each loop order. So suppose you want to compute something at 6 loops. You start with the system, which has order 3,000 parameters, and then you start going down, down, and down, applying various constraints, so such as parity symmetry, dihedral symmetry, various collinear limit, multi-regi kinematics, Steinman relations, etc., 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 and you continue until you find a unique solution. And again, as I said, for 6 points, this has been done by Dixon and collaborators up to 7 loops. Now, of course, it's remarkable that there is a unique solution. It's a very such a great theory, and it's so constrained. So just that fact is remarkable as well. Okay, very good. So these are these very high loop computations. So now let me tell you a little bit about some of the tools. So there are lots of tools. There are lots of interesting things. So I'll just mention the 2 most kind of important ones. So first, we're computing scattering amplitudes. They're functions of usually of a momentum. So instead of using momentum P, one goes to momentum twistor space. So we label amplitudes by n points zi, which are in P3. Now, as I already mentioned, n equals 4 Yang-Mills theory has dual conformal symmetry. So in these variables, dual conformal symmetry is nothing but SL4C. And there is a natural SL4C invariant, which I wrote here. So everywhere, any paper on n equals 4 Yang-Mills amplitudes you open, you'll see those brackets. So these are these 4 brackets of momentum twistors. This is nothing but the determinant that of the 4x4 matrix that I've written here. So that's the variables. Now, functions. So what kind of functions are we talking about? Well, again, for n equals 4, we are dealing with very special functions. So it's known that believe that at least MHV and NMHV L loop amplitudes can be expressed in terms of these multi-polylog functions. And the weight of that polylogs is twice the loop order. Now, beyond NMHV, like at 10-point and cubed MHV, you might have heard some elliptic polylogs start appearing, and there's a whole program, and there's a sort of small community of people who are working on those. So for my talk, I'm just going to restrict to these. So what are these generalized polylogs? Well, okay, so you can just define them recursively. So if you have a weight M polylog, you take its differential, and you can write it as weight M minus 1 polylog d log. And then you continue d weight M minus 1 is M minus 2 d log, and so on, until you hit for M equals 1, that's the usual log. And the coefficient in front of it will be some rational number f0. So given this, we can then define the symbol of the polylog, of these polylog functions, and we just define it by nothing but the tensor product. So it's an M tensor product of all the arguments that appear here in these d logs. Okay, so for example, let me just quickly give you an example. So, oops, I have to move this. Okay, so like take lead 2, you know that d of lead 2 is minus log 1 minus z, d log z. So that's a weight 2 polylog, and the symbol of that is minus 1 minus z times z. So what the focus of, so there are lots of interesting things I could say here, but I'm just going to stay focused. And what I'm going to be focused in this talk is this symbol alphabet. And so what is a symbol alphabet given an amplitude? That's a collection of all possible arguments that could appear in those d logs. Okay, so that's denoted by phi alpha here. Now so what's the meaning of this? So first of all, it encodes singularities of amplitudes. That's number one. And number two, it's also is an input in the bootstrap program that I had on the previous slide. So in fact, when I said, okay, you start with a function, what you actually start with here, you start with some symbol at some high loop order. So what I will tell you a little bit today is how do you know and what are the properties of this symbol alphabet for as you increase the number of points. Okay, so let me just quickly give you an example. Suppose you know what is the symbol alphabet and what's the amplitude. So suppose you are looking at 2 loop MHV amplitudes for 6 and 7 points. So for 6 points, what's the symbol alphabet? It's just given by Pluka coordinates on GR for 6. Okay, so for 7 points, you have nothing but Pluka coordinates. So you have 35 Pluka coordinates there. Plus you have these 14 other coordinates, which are 7 cyclic images of these two expressions. So both of these are just some quadratic. So now some quadratic functions of Pluka coordinates start appearing. And if you were interested in what the actual function is, so you are 2 loops, so you want to have weight 4. So it will be lead 4 of all these various brackets. And at 7 points, you have a more complicated function called lead 2, and again, as you can see here, a more complicated symbol letters start appearing. So, but the thing to remember is, 6 points alphabet is given by the 15 letters, and 7-point alphabet is given by these 49 letters. So so where does this come from? This comes from some amplitude computations. Okay, so far this is all you take your amplitude, you do some computation, and that's the result. So I'm just telling you the final result. So what we'd like, the question I'm interested in, and we're interested in, if there is an independent mathematical description of these symbol letters. Okay, so for 6 and 7 points, it's been well known for some time that the answer to this question is yes. And indeed, these letters could be described by cluster algebras. So let me have a quick overview, quick reminder what these cluster algebras are. So, so in particular, we observed that the symbol alphabets are given by the subsets of the cluster coordinates of something called Grassmannian cluster algebra, GR for n. So what's quickly a cluster algebra? So it's defined by 2 things. It's defined, first you want to have an initial quiver. That's fixed by the type of algebra you are talking about. So this is how it looks like for GR for n. And number 2, you want to specify a certain mutation rule. So given initial quiver, there's a certain rule, which, depending on how the arrows are connected in the quiver. So you have this mutation rule, and it produces for you. So you take each coordinate, you apply this mutation rule, you produce for each coordinate a new coordinate, a prime coordinate, and so on. It produces you what's known cluster coordinates. So it's a very well-defined procedure. Now these, so why we're here. So these cluster algebras were invented about 20 years ago by Fomin and Zelivinsky, and it's an active area in mathematics. They appear in other areas, etc. But if you are not familiar with this, I would recommend you can just Google cluster algebra portal, and it contains everything you wanted to know. Okay, so for example, since I've been giving kind of baby examples of 6 and 7s, so here are cluster coordinates for 6 and 7 point amplitudes. So we forget the amplitudes, we just open math paper and we say, okay, so what's the cluster coordinates for 6 and 7 points? Okay, so there we are. So here, remember the initial quiver was like something like 3 by n minus 5. So the initial quiver, ignore the coordinates in the box, just something like this. So what I taught you, so that's the initial quiver. Now you want to mutate and produce new coordinates. So if you mutate on this node, you get this quiver and so on. So and this process continues. So until you get, so for this case, you get 14 quivers and you exactly reproduce 15 cluster coordinates. So for 7 points, you start with a different initial quiver and there are, more quivers. And then the nice thing is that you look at what cluster coordinates you produced and you get exactly the symbol letters that we obtained from our amplitudes computations. So this is very cool that there is a mathematical constructions that mathematicians studied that appears in n=4 Young-Mills theory. Okay, so great. So this has been what I've just explained has been known for a long time, and it's nice, but we would like to go further. So what's happening recently? Okay, so well, it turns out that the new features start arising as you increase the number of points. So first of all, these cluster algebras become infinite when n is greater than 7. And second of all, as I said, the amplitudes computations have been done recently, and it turns out that symbol letters involve square roots. So previously, we only had quadratic functions of these Pluto coordinates. So now, just to flesh it out, so we, the 6 and 7s were very, very easy symbol letters, but as you go to 8, this become quite more complicated. So there are like, these rational letters, which are at most quadratic and cubic functions of Kluckers, but then there are also letters involving square roots, okay? So these are the 8-point computations, and these are the 9-point computations of just these letters. So just these letters are not as simple to explain, and these were done by Song He and his group, okay? So what we'd like to do now, we'd like to see, similar to our 6 and 7-point examples, we would like to see if there is some mathematical description of these two slides. So very simple, these are the letters. Can we describe them in a, previously we just said, okay, these are cluster coordinates for GR46 and GR47. Okay, so that's the question, okay? So let me just have a glass of water. Okay, so the question, that's kind of, we're moving on to more recent developments, and there's been several approaches to answer this question, and starting maybe in the last year and a half. So there's been, I will flash basically a slide per first two. There's been an approach using tropical geometry by James Drummond and others. There's an approach, I'm sure you've heard from Nima, using dual polytopes explaining these features. But I'll try to focus a little bit more on our approach using clavigraphs and tensor diagrams to describe them. And finally, there's also an approach by actually Henrietta's student using scattering diagrams. So very good. Actually, Henrietta, how much time do I have?
You have about 6 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to basically skip the tropical geometry and dual polytopes and just tell you like a couple, like 3 minutes per approach. Now that I've explained the problem, so how can we get these symbol letters? Well, we can get them from clavigraphs. So it's been known for some time that the building blocks of these n=4 amplitudes could be a Youngian invariants, which are described by these integrals, where the matrix in this integral is parameterized as a cell of positive Grassmannian. Now, these cells are in correspondence with Plaby graphs. So that's an example of a Plaby graph. And so our strategy is very simple. We start with a Plaby graph, and then we solve this delta function, CZ. So there's this associated to Plaby graph, there's a C, and then compare with known symbol letters. So very, very simple way to try to produce it. So here's an example. So let's go back to 6 points. So here's a Plaby graph for 6 points. You write your C matrix, you solve for the phase variables in a given way, and you start producing the letters. So in this way, we could go and draw some simple things for 6 and 7 points and produce exactly this symbol alphabet. So we have a mathematical construction describing these letters. So the interesting thing, of course, is try to do it for something, for some of these square roots. So indeed, you take the simplest 8-point graphs and you can get the square roots. So I guess we were very excited about such simple ways, of getting those square roots. But unfortunately, but then that turned into a little program that, we had to write paper number 1, number 2, and number 3, because if you look at, so you don't want to just compute algebraic letters, you also want to, here there's some rational letters. So it turns out that there's some subtleties that in order to produce the rational letters, you have to allow some non-Plabic matrices. Okay, so, but the upshot of this is that we were able to identify a set of graphs that reproduce all known 8 and 9-point symbol alphabets, so the 2 slides that I showed you. However, we don't have yet a theory explaining the pattern of which cells associated to which symbol letters observed in amplitude. So what we're doing is providing some phenological data in hope that future work will shed more light on this interesting problem. So now let me spend 2 more minutes about discussing a second approach that to the same problem that wrote another paper about. So there's something else interesting. So cluster algebra literature is a very broad subject. So it turns out those cluster variables can be represented by tensor diagrams who were who were invented by Fomin and Pilявsky in 2016. And to each tensor diagram, one can associate a tensor invariant. So these are, I've just, I'm not going to introduce tensor diagrams here, but I've just written some examples and their tensor invariants. So Fomin and Pilявsky proved, Fomin and Pilявsky conjectured that a planar tensor diagram is so they conjectured that for an aberrizable tensor, for an aberrizable web, the tensor invariant is a cluster variable. So a web is aberrizable if it can be turned into a tree diagram using some Stein relation. So I don't want to go in great details in here. So, but using these techniques, we can obviously produce all the rational letters. Now it gets more interesting with the square roots. Basically, we have a proposal to look at the webs that can be reduced to one in a loop, and then we can assign to it a certain web series using some rules. So here is a tensor diagram with one in a loop, and then we showed so there's some rules how do you write down this W. So then we showed that you can sum this, and then at the end, the series takes the following form, where the poles of this expression are exactly the square roots that appear in symbol alphabet for 8 and 9 points. Okay, so I could give a whole lecture series on just this, but I hope what I try to do here, I just try to give you a flavor of kind of things we have been thinking about and kind of mathematical constructions that that appear in this n equals 4 Yang-Mills theory amplitudes. So with this, I'm going to conclude. So that's my concluding slide. So symbol alphabet of n equals 4 Young-Mills amplitudes is described by the Grassmannian cluster algebras for 6 and 7 points. Now, starting at 8 points, one needs a mechanism producing the finite subsets in this cluster algebras, and also a mechanism to produce the square roots. There's been some interesting approaches, proposals to study these. And what we've done, we've studied candidate mechanisms coming from Flaby graphs and from tensor diagrams to address this problem. So looking further, so indeed, I mean, we're doing this very phenomenologically, example by example. It certainly would be nice to have to do it more systematically. Moreover, there's some relation between Flaby graphs and tensor diagrams, which we don't honestly understand very well, but it would be nice to understand the relation between all these different approaches. Finally, I just focused on how do we know the symbol alphabet, but of course, then there's a lot of activity also, how do you write down the cluster functions, which correspond to the final amplitude. And finally, of course, a lot of what I said was special to n equals 4 Young-Mills theory. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of the tools and methods that we use for n equals 4 have been applied to, computing some of the integrals that are useful for PUCD. And moreover, there were several papers recently also observing cluster structure in just Feynman integrals. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. Let's see if there are any questions. So I have one. So you gave a few slides ago the list of 5 different approaches. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the strengths of each of these approaches and maybe how they complement each other.
Okay, so right. So first there is a tropical geometry approach, so by James et al. So there they get exactly the symbol letters for 8 points. And recently there was a paper by Jonas Papathanassiou et al. Generalizing that for 9 points. Then there's an approach by Nima where they find evidence for the type of square roots, but they don't produce exactly the letters. Moreover, the method of Fraser et al. is a more complicated one. I like Flaby graphs the best, so that's what I will say.
And Freddie has a question.
Yes, I also agree that Flaby graphs are great.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, but my question is if you can say a little bit. I tried to go through your papers and realize that you use this generalized Mandelstam invariance and so on. I mean, how do they enter in the story? I couldn't.
You mean
I mean they are not in your slides, but in your paper you have this generalized Mandelstam invariance that depend on several indices and.
The X's. You mean you talk about tensor diagram paper?
Yeah, the S's. Yeah, the S's.
Yeah, we were just discussing that maybe we didn't have to even include those. So yeah.
I see.
So
Okay.
I mean, yeah, if we were to write this paper again, I think we would, I don't know if Lichian is on call here, so he likes them, but I would rewrite that paper in the way I just presented it.
I see. Okay, no problem.
So I think the time is up, so we should turn over to the following discussion, and hopefully there'll be more discussions of cluster algebras on Slack. So let's thank Anastasia and Gonkao again.
Thank you very much. So yeah, let's resume the discussions. So very short reminder about these discussions.